everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime lecture from the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies. And I am delighted to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Sean Henry. Sean is a lecturer at Maynooth University, and he lectures in the area of philosophy of education. He is a graduate of DCU, where he studied theology and education and English, and he is a qualified teacher, and he has experience of working in the classroom teaching English and religion. He gained a master's degree from UCD in the area of equality studies, and he went on to do his PhD in Maynooth University in the area of philosophy of education, and his PhD thesis is titled Queering Religious Schooling, Teaching, Values, Rituals. Sean has been disseminating his really innovative research at conferences, and I've had the pleasure of hearing him in the past. And he interrupts the conventional opposition that's often set up, the fake binary between religion and queerness. And it gives us great joy to welcome him to the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies today. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks so much, Trish, and to Carly and to the whole Institute. Thank you so much for giving me this space today to share a few ideas. The title for my presentation this afternoon is Why and How? Queering Schooling for Jewish, Christian and Muslim Education. So in starting the presentation, I just thought I'd map out the trajectory that I'm going to follow this afternoon. In terms of the overall aim for this presentation, I hope, as Trish was saying in the introduction, to challenge the opposition or the antagonism that's often set up between religion and LGBTQ priorities in the context of Jewish, Christian and Muslim education. So it is my belief that this opposition isn't always helpful in educational theorizing. So today will be a space, hopefully, for us to begin thinking about why disrupting this antagonism is important and how it might be done, both theoretically and practically or pedagogically. So I offer the view this afternoon that such a prerogative, disrupting the opposition between religion and queerness, is necessary for me, considering what I call the generative potential of education. So in other words, education's investment in generating new ways of thinking and feeling and being in the world. What I have on the screen as the creation of something or someone new or different. And what I hope to argue for this afternoon is for the educational necessity of disrupting the religious queer divide, on the basis that it is through such disruption that new ways of thinking and being in the world can be potentially enacted. So, taking this generative quality seriously, I claim that disrupting the religious LGBTQ divide can be achieved through an approach to teaching in religious schooling that A, refuses to sanitize the worst dimensions of religion. So in disrupting the religion queer divide, it's my claim this afternoon that this can only be achieved if we face the ugliness of religious heteronormativity seriously. We're not going to disrupt this divide by putting our heads in the sand. But at the same time, though, I'm also committed to coming up with productive ways of responding to this tension by being attentive, as point B says on the screen, by being attentive to alternative religious resources, to subaltern voices both within and beyond religious traditions. And in achieving this aim, I'm going to turn in particular to queer Jewish, Christian and Muslim perspectives, and hope to begin a conversation this afternoon as to how those resources might help in the overall aim that I've mapped out. So that's the aim. Hopefully we'll achieve that, but I'm really looking forward as well to getting your thoughts on the subject, not only in terms of sharing together, but also in terms of helping me with my own thinking, which is for me always something in process. So to begin then, this theme of the religious queer divide, it's a divide that's played out in education for some time. particularly in the context of religious traditions and their relationship to sexuality. So I'm thinking as one example of the protests that emerged in the UK context in 2019 against the No Outsiders programme, where majority Muslim parents in Birmingham protested against the No Outsiders programme being initiated in schools. And one of the reasons for this was that from many of the parents' perspectives, engaging with LGBT issues, which the No Outsiders programme sought to do, was inappropriate for children so young, and also was potentially hostile to their own faith commitments. However, the divide between religious and LGBTQ priority is not solely unique to religious traditions. Indeed, many LGBTQ discourses can also be seen as falling back on the assumption that religion and LGBTQ priorities are necessarily opposed. So, for example, in the Canadian context, the research by Tanya Callahan or Andre P. Grace and Christopher Wells have pointed to the opposition that's often lived out by those who are interested in LGBTQ initiatives in education, how such perspectives are often resistant to religious schooling based on the assumption that religion is deeply and inevitably heteronormative. So both from religious and LGBTQ perspectives, this tension is rife. However, in recent times, there have been growing developments within and outside religious traditions that have begun to problematize this dichotomy. So, for instance, only a few days ago, in response to Pope Francis's comments around the recognition of civil unions for same-sex couples, the Archbishop of Dublin, Dermot Martin, came out in support of Pope Francis's statements. Now, I must emphasize the fact that such endorsements, both by the papacy and by Archbishop Dermot, didn't go so far as, for example, reforming traditional theological perspectives on marriage. But I did think that the moment represented a pastoral sensitivity and openness that, from my perspective at least, wasn't always there within Catholic theorizing and Catholic reflection. So I think based on this context, the time is rife to start thinking about how we can think about this relationship in new ways. Right, so that's the scene, if you like. And now the question of why. Why might this be a valuable endeavour for education? There are many reasons why disrupting the religious LGBTQ divide might be seen as valuable. So there are ethical reasons for this. So based on our ethical relations with LGBTQ people that we ourselves might know in our own personal lives, those kinds of relationships matter and might indeed be the basis from which disrupting this divide becomes necessary. But apart from that ethical dimension, there are also theological reasons for seeking to disrupt this divide. I'm thinking in the context of the Catholic tradition, I'm thinking of the theological work of scholars such as Todd Salzman or Michael Lawler, who from a Catholic perspective have argued against the adequacy of traditionally heteronormative accounts of theology. So, for example, theologies of the body that seek to valorize, kind of Catholic concepts of complementarity and so on. So, from a theological perspective, many theologians have argued against the traditional framing of these issues as theologically inadequate. So that is another reason, I suppose, for beginning to think about why this might be necessary. There are also sociological and personal reasons for this. The world we're living in is changing, and the too easy binaries that are often set up to understand our world are quickly collapsing under the complexities of what it means to live in the 21st century. But for the purposes of this presentation, I thought I'd focus on an educational reason for disrupting this divide. For it is in the arena of education and pedagogy that I think this disruption is both needed, but also potentially very valuable. And the educational basis for my resistance to this divide this afternoon is what I'm terming the generative nature of education. So I'm arguing that education is involved, at least in part, with the generation of new ways of being and relating with others in the world. And that if we are to take this commitment seriously, then this might demand a new way of thinking about religion's relationship to LGBTQ issues. Otherwise, we'll fall back on reproducing more of the same, if you like. So what do I mean, just in terms of unpacking this a little bit more, the generative nature of education. So thinking of education as generative for me assumes that educational encounters and experiences are in some way committed to the potential creation of something or someone new or different. So this doesn't need to be like grand sweeping moments of complete reformation. This could also be something as simple as a new perspective on something, a new question that you wouldn't have considered before, a new text that you hadn't encountered. For me, all of these dimensions are part of what I see to be the generative nature of education. So in this sense, education, which our societies value so highly in both in public investment and in other forms, the reason why I think valuing education is important is because it generates opportunities for change in how we relate to human and non-human others in the world. So education becomes valuable, becomes worthwhile, not solely, but it does become so when it provides that chance to encounter something different, to think about and feel the world in a new way. So if we were to take that generative dimension seriously, teaching on this meaning, when someone decides to be a teacher, I think that decision comes with it a commitment to work that's interruptive in some way, by which I mean work that seeks to generate opportunities for change through the relation that pedagogy stages between the student on the one hand and the text, idea, experience, or practice under study on the other. So I'm just thinking of, for example, from my own experience of schooling, those teachers who really had an impact on me, who really shaped how I think about the world, both in secondary school context, but also at university level. They were those teachers who challenged me, that interrupted my thinking, that provided a space for me to question some assumptions that I had, to think about the world and my place within it in a way that might be different to how it was before. So for me, the generative nature of education arises from when pedagogical encounters allow for this change in some sense. And again, as I say, these changes could be quite dramatic, or they might be more subtle and day-to-day. Neither kind of change dismisses the value of the other, I don't think. So from bringing this back to the divide between religion and LGBTQ issues that often plays out, for me, the generative nature of education entails curating pedagogical experiences that can offer our students the chance to be addressed by a world that is other to them, and in this way generate potentially new ways of relating to it. So in relation to the LGBTQ religious divide that often plays out in our culture, I see the generative nature of education as disrupting this, as if we take that quality to education seriously, education becomes something where the religious LGBTQ divide isn't just reproduced as it was before. Educationally, it becomes necessary to think about it differently, to provide opportunities for new ways of reflecting on what it might mean to be religious or what it might mean to be queer, in ways that don't assume that one is opposed to the other. So in this sense, the generative nature of education calls on us to recognize the fact that queer and religious perspectives are always forever in process. And because of this, open to new perspectives and new experiences that previous orthodoxies might not have allowed for or entertained. So in this sense, then, kind of my reason for disrupting the religious LGBTQ divide can be read as a direct challenge to those, for instance, in certain manifestations of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim education, who see education as tied to the preservation of religious orthodoxies that espouse traditional family values or traditional forms of gender and sexual expression. Now, I'm not suggesting that education isn't involved in the preservation of tradition. I think it would be both naive and inaccurate to suggest that. Indeed, for instance, when I was an English teacher, when one introduces a student to Shakespeare for the first time, in that moment of exposure, there is a certain degree of preservation there. You are preserving a heritage that you deem valuable to pass on. But for me, the generative nature of education and teaching demands that that preservation is also complemented by opportunities for change and transformation. So yes, we pass on traditions, but educationally it also becomes necessary to open those traditions out to something new or different. And for me, this is the challenge that's posed to traditional modes of religious education that might seek to preserve heteronormative understandings of religious identity or LGBTQ experience. Because in order to be educational for me, the possibility for that divide to be disrupted becomes important. Now, for many, this kind of openness to change and transformation could risk falling into some kind of moral relativism where everything and anything goes. But for me, that's not so. Taking the generative nature of education seriously does not entail a no-holds-barred relativism, if you like, where everything and anything can be abandoned. So such a critique forgets the relation to the other that acts as the cornerstone of education's generative qualities. So in other words, when we expose traditions, religious traditions, queer perspectives, whatever they might be, when we expose that pedagogical content to possibilities otherwise untold and unforeseen, we do so not for the sake of it, not out of a desire for change's sake, but rather out of a responsiveness to those with whom we relate, our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, for example. So for me, the transformative or generative dimensions of education are necessary, not simply because change is good for the sake of changing, but because the lives and experiences of those who are othered demands that kind of response. So in this sense, I'm not setting up a clear-cut binary between, let's say, the work of the school and the lives of those who live in society. For me, they're always codependent and receptive to one another. So in this sense, I guess, responding to the generative nature of education becomes a matter of responding to the incompleteness of the present. And I'm drawing from Roger Simon's work here, who argues that the interruptive quality to teaching emerges from an attunement or an attention to the fact that the traditions in which we find ourselves are always and forever in process. They're never complete. Narratives, traditions, practices, and other forms of social organization have never reached their endpoint, if you like. They're incomplete. There's always something more to be done. There's always another perspective to consider, particularly because of the lives of those who might be marginalized or excluded. So for me, disrupting the LGBTQ religious divide becomes important because if we don't, we fail to take account of that incompleteness. We fail to take seriously the fact that our traditions are only ever works in progress and therefore need to be attuned to the lives of those who might otherwise be silenced. So responding to this incompleteness, as you can see on the screen there, it becomes a response to the untold and unseen realities of our world, to those who live lives and experiences that may have been previously excluded or ignored. So responding to LGBTQ lives in a way that resists an antagonistic relation to religion therefore becomes a matter of educational necessity. The incompleteness of the present demands an attention to the lives of sexual and gendered minorities. But equally, and this isn't on the screen, but equally I would also be of the view that queer modes of education that seek to enact a commitment to queer liberation, I believe those modes of education also need to be receptive to the subaltern religious voices that may not be always recognized within those discourses and traditions. Because otherwise you reproduce that antagonism in a different guise, and you fail to provide those opportunities for new ways of relating in the world. All our traditions, whether they be religious, committed to queer forms of organizing, whatever they might be, they're always and forever incomplete. There is always another to whom we must respond, to whom our responsibility emerges as a pressing educational concern. So that's kind of for me why I think disrupting this antagonism is so important. But there's also the question of how this can be done. How can we achieve this? And so for the last 5 minutes of this presentation, I thought I'd kind of begin reflecting on that. And for me, this can be achieved by firstly refusing to sanitize the worst dimensions of religion. So the heteronormativity of religion, the exclusion of those who might identify as LGBTQ or otherwise, we can't put our heads in the sand in this. We can't put our heads in the sand in this regard. We can't pretend that this isn't something that's a reality. In this sense, then, responding to that context requires for me an attention to alternative subaltern voices within religious traditions. So I'm going to map out very briefly what both of those might involve in more detail. So a refusal to sanitize. So bridging the religious LGBTQ divide for Jewish, Christian and Muslim education is, for me, it's not an exercise in what I've called theological centrism. So in other words, it's not a center ground where you're trying to acquiesce to orthodoxies that came before. So in other words, it's not about granting legitimacy to the homophobia of previous doctrines, practices and traditions. For me, that won't get us very far. In this sense, then, responding and resisting the religious LGBTQ divide calls on us to resist tendencies to explain away religious heteronormativity, through the register of a few bad eggs. Religious heteronormativity is the exception rather than the rule. And for me, I find, and this is just from the perspective that I'm coming from, and I'm really looking forward to engage with you on it, I don't think that approach helps, because not only does it undermine the experiences of heteronormativity that our LGBTQ brothers and sisters might have experienced, it also fails to do justice to the fact that religion is always and forever a work in progress. I think acknowledging the fact that some things in the past have not gone well and continue not to go well, I think that actually provides us with the basis from which change can happen. So responding to the incompleteness of religion entails an explicit engagement with the realities of religious heteronormativity, to its ugliness, because it's only by facing that conflict head on that actually empowering futures can be enacted and allowed for our students. Shying away from this will fail to generate new modes of relating to the world and our place within it. So taking that refusal to sanitize seriously, what are the kinds of resources, what are the kinds of strategies that we can appeal to, both in our educational theorizing, but also in our day-to-day practices in schools and classrooms? So for me, if we are to achieve this work, we must attend to subaltern voices within and beyond Jewish, Christian and Muslim traditions. So in other words, falling into despair is not an option for me here. We need to attend to alternative perspectives that might allow us to think about religion's relationship to queerness productively. And in this sense, this exercise, this work, this commitment, this project involves refusing to grant monopoly to singular narratives around gender and sexuality in religious traditions. For many of us, perhaps in the lecture this afternoon, I'm not going to make assumptions, but I'm assuming that some of you at least might be receptive to the fact that lots of our religious traditions are far more pluralistic and diverse than sometimes conventional accounts of sexuality attend to. I myself know many people within the context of the Church of Ireland tradition, within the Catholic tradition, within various Jewish and Muslim traditions, that are very receptive to the kind of work that I do. And so I think in disrupting the religious LGBTQ divide, educationally, we need to respond to that plurality. We need to take seriously the fact that no tradition is monolithic, and that many traditions, in fact, contain the resources, or at least potential resources, for this productive work to be done. So, for example, within the context of Reform Judaism, Elliot Kukla, who is a transgender Jewish rabbi, has written the following: God creates a diversity of bodies and an abundance of desires that is far too complex for human beings to understand. This conveys an understanding that all people are created by the hand of heaven, and that every divine creation is entitled to be seen, loved, and desired. So from a Jewish perspective, there are traditions of thinking that are receptive to the pluralities of what it means to live in the world, to the incompleteness of the traditions within which we find ourselves, and to the possibilities that that incompleteness might allow for in terms of resisting the religious LGBTQ divide. Now, it must be said that Judaism is not unique in this. Indeed, Christianity has a long-standing tradition of queer theologizing and queer theorizing. So some of you might be familiar with the work of Marcella Althaus-Reid, who is considered by some to be, these phrases are always a bit spurious, aren't they? But kind of like the founding mother of queer theology within the context of Christian thinking. Though I would probably argue that Elizabeth Stewart is also a really significant figure in that regard. But anyway, she also talks about the capacity for theology to be receptive to queer experience in a way that does not sanitize this question. So let's have a look at the quotation on the screen. So that the divine immersed itself in flesh, and that flesh is now divine, is queer theology at its peak. There can be no sanitization here, or something of the divine essence will be lost. It is not the genetically modified metaphysical Son of God that declares the divine human conjunction, but the screaming baby born amidst the cow shit and fleas, covered in his birthing blood. So in other words, it's in the messiness of the lives that we live, the baby born amidst the cow shit and fleas. It's in that messiness that a divine human relationship is realized. It's in that messiness that God reveals God's self to the world, if we are to follow the example of the incarnation that Althaus-Reid and Isherwood are referring to. So for me, this kind of sensitivity is important because it demonstrates the pluralities within our traditions and the resources that we have at our disposal to carry out this work of resisting narratives that often pit religion against queerness. And then finally, from a Muslim perspective, Dervla Shanahan has also foregrounded the possibility of being sensitive to queer futures within the Islamic faith without sanitizing the homophobia that has come before. So she writes the following: so a faith-centered, anti-homophobic reading of the Quran and of any other text would necessarily look at the whens and wheres of how divine love has historically been interpreted as only present along straight lines, straight families, straight bodies, and straight lovers, and the ways that interpretation may serve to read and write privilege onto gendered bodies. So for Shanahan, resisting the divide between the Muslim faith and queer identities involves a commitment, a direct commitment to facing the homophobia that is present within the traditions of Islam, but also about reinterpreting those contexts in new and different ways, in a way that responds to the lives of those who identify as LGBTQ. So I hope that's given you a flavour of the orientation of the work that I think is valuable and the resources that might be necessary for this work to happen. So by way of conclusion, I just thought I'd share with you the following quotation by Denise Egea-Kuhn, who talks about how are we to relate to our traditions in the context of education. So she writes the following: since our heritage comes before us, it comes to us. It is received by us without our being given a chance to choose it. We are born to it, like we are born to our language, which is part of it. What is left to us is the power to reaffirm it, that is, to accept it and to confirm it. Yet, not without a critical step. Consequently, and paradoxically, one can be faithful to one's heritage only in as much as one accepts to be unfaithful to it, to analyse it, to critique it, to interpret it relentlessly. So for me, this relentless commitment to reinterpreting and reimagining our traditions is something that the incompleteness of our traditions calls for, and is also something that I think will be educationally important. So thank you very much.